So now to the program. Please join me in welcoming one of the Colonnade Club's governors and the current chair of our Historic and Intellectual Programming Committee, Dr. Gregory Sadhoff.
Thank you, Sarah Elizabeth. And I'll tell you, I'm humbled that to take over this role as chair and to have Don Detmer, one of UVA's great leaders, as former chair and in the audience today. As those of you who know local history, UVA history, this was a place of great tumult in the years leading up to the Civil War in many ways. One morning was particularly startling. And on that morning, as students rose from their rooms on the lawn and professors began their day, they noticed that there was a huge Confederate flag flying over the rotunda. Many years later, those students who were able to get it up over the night talked proudly about that and the surprise that it was for all involved. But there are other things about this university that we know less about. And that's why I'm so pleased that our speaker today, Dr. Will Kurtz, will speak about the UVA Unionist story as the university and the student body became more intertwined in the war. Dr. William Kurtz is the Now Center's managing director and digital historian. He is a graduate of University of Notre Dame, where he received his undergraduate degree in history. And then he came to UVA and received both his master's and in 2012 his PhD under the mentorship of and advice of Gary Gallagher. Will has two digital projects currently. One is called Black Virginians in Blue, and the other is UVA Unionists during the Civil War. He is the author of a book about the role of Catholicism and Catholics in the South during the Civil War, before and after, and the book is entitled Excommunicated from the Union. He is now working on a second book. It's a biography of the Union Major General William Stark Rosecrans. Just a few more things about Dr. Kurtz. He spent 4 years at the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities, was the assistant editor for the Documents Compass, and was also a veteran of Founders Online and People of the Founding Era. On a personal note, Will is a native of Phoenix, though on warm days like this, I'm sure it reminds him of home. And he and his wife recently welcomed the birth of their third child. So I'd like to ask that we welcome Will.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Greg. Yes, it's warm like Phoenix, but it's not quite the same heat, isn't it? It's not like sticking your head right into an oven and wondering when it's going to end. And when it ends is after Halloween, actually, when it finally gets below 100 degrees again in the Phoenix area. There's a reason why I never go back in the summer to visit my old hometown. So I'd like to do some thank yous. I know I'll get them out of my way as quickly as I can, but I really think that this is a team effort, this project. You'll wonder when I tell you how many people we're talking about, how there could be so much involved in this, but my philosophy with UVA Unionists was to be exhaustive, to track down every single lead we found, whether it was a newspaper, court case, archival record. We have been scouring across the country for this project. Most of our work has been done at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and a little bit across the way in Library of Congress. However, we've been out to the Huntington in Los Angeles, California. University of Notre Dame has some relevant records, Catholic University of America as well. The Ohio History Center, I was just there this past May doing some research on two of our soldiers, UVA Unionists. And then one of my graduate students was just up at the Union Theological Seminary in New York City, researching a gentleman I'll tell you a little bit more about. towards the end of the talk. This project was made possible with the technical assistance of the Institute for Advanced Technology and the Humanities, also known as IATH. You can see their logo there. And then the generous, very, very generous support of Wayne Cozart, Amy Bonner, and the entire board of the Jefferson Trust at the Alumni Association of the University of Virginia. It's such an incredible program, the Jefferson Trust. I can't believe that more universities don't have it. It's really just really made possible our research in a way that we would never have been able to do without their support. I also am really proud of the fact that a lot of the work on these projects, Black Virginians in Blue, which Greg mentioned, which is one of the digital projects, and UVA Unionists has been done by our students. So a lot of really high quality research, analysis of conflicting records, because if you've ever gone into a military service record from the 19th century or a pension, there's about 10 different times a person was born. Which one of them is right? Or who's right? Was it a dishonorable discharge, or did he go out with a brevet brigadier generalship? That's a bit of an extreme case, but you get my point. And so I'd like to highlight especially Lily Snodgrass, a university undergraduate who is here with me as a summer intern. A lot of the statistics you're going to hear today were done by her under my direction, but she did a lot of really great research on what these men were up to after the Civil War. And then Brian Newman, who's an outstanding graduate student who worked for the Jefferson University Early Life Project, which we rely upon all the time in our work. He was the one who just walked into my office one day. I had a list of about 24 of these men. I thought I was doing pretty well. And he says, so when are we going to get to that UVA project? And I said, well, it's kind of on the back burner, Brian. He says, well, I just went through 8,000 students who attended UVA before the Civil War and cross-referenced them against databases of Civil War soldiers and found some really interesting facts. He found the vast majority of these men with this tireless effort, and he actually uncovered a lot more information about the Confederate experience as well. So I'd like to highlight what he did. That's a good segue, the Confederate experience, into something that Dr. Caroline Janey spoke about when she was here a few months ago. She talked about the overall history of the university, obviously focusing on the Confederate aspect of Charlottesville, Albemarle County, and the university, because let's face it, there's a reason why the memory of this place has a Confederate tinge to it, not a Confederate tinge. The whole thing is about the Confederacy. It's because the university was so on board with the Confederate project. I'm going to go through a few quick findings, some of them which are ours, some I'm repeating from other historians. So located in the heart of the Confederacy, Albemarle County and Charlottesville were pretty much untouched by the war, at least by Union occupation, until very late in 1865 when Sheridan came through and caused that kerfuffle about the historical marker that was near the chapel for a while. I can't get into that, I'm sorry. That's a fun story. Brian's research found that over 3,000, the previous number was 2,400, over 3,000 university students were in the Confederate military, either the Army or the Navy. That's 50% of all students or alumni who are alive in 1861. That's a staggering number when you consider that much older school, like in the North, say Harvard, only sent about 1,000 men. At least 500 of those men died. As I said, we're revising the number up, so I expect that the number of dead will go up as well. But the accepted number is about 500 men who were on the plaques on the rotunda. There were many officers represented. The old figures, I haven't had the time to research all this, to update this, but the old figures are 26 generals had UVA connections in the Confederate service, 98 colonels, and two of the most prominent men you can see right here on the slide are John Mosby, the Great Ghost, who caused a lot of trouble up in Northern Virginia, and then the fellow below him who was slightly less competent, John Bankhead Magruder of Williamsburg fame, who got on the wrong side of Robert E. Lee and was sent to Texas, which just gives more credence to that old saying of General Sheridan that If I owned both hell and Texas, I would rent out Texas and live in hell. Sorry. His words, not mine. I'm not endorsing them. I'm just saying. It wasn't a place that you wanted to go. There were at least 14 UVA-affiliated people in the Provisional Confederate Congress. The Permanent Confederate Congress, there are 24 men with ties to UVA. There were 5 people in Jefferson Davis's cabinet, which there were a lot of people in Jefferson Davis's cabinet because it was a revolving door for a lot of these positions. So it's not quite as impressive as it sounds compared to Lincoln's more stable one. But 5 people with UVA ties, including at one point Secretary of War James A. Seddon, who decided that no, he couldn't grant an exemption to UVA students and get them out of the Confederate draft. That's my lecture on the university, I'm afraid. And then, of course, the memory of the Civil War here has been all about the Confederacy, about those 1,906 rotunda plaques that were up until recently in 2017. And then there was a probably lesser well-known, in 1912, they invited back all the surviving Confederate veterans of the war who attended UVA in that first year, 1860 to 61, through the end of the war. Anyone who donned the Confederate gray and was a student at some point during those years was invited back. There were determined to be 118 men still alive at that time. And when you consider the enrollment during the Civil War, that's actually quite a bit, but only about 30 of them showed up. There's a picture of them in front of the rotunda, and there were medals that were struck, and it was actually rolled in, this giant celebration was rolled into commencement. So this is a really big deal that, the center of the university's, celebration of the academic year also became this cause for celebrating its Confederate past. But that raises a question: why didn't they only invited back the Confederate veterans? Perhaps there were other veterans as well who might still have been alive. And this question was raised in 1913 by the Stanton Daily News. And in an article called Neglected Alumni, which you can see right here, this is the rebuttal to this article. They said, "What? You just published an obituary about a man named Charles Irving Wilson, who attained the rank of brigadier general by the end of his life, but he was a Union soldier. What about these guys? Are you telling me that this is the only man?" UVA admitted that we know there's no complete list of the Union soldiers or sailors that have ever been compiled, and they left it at that. The issue was basically laid dormant until we picked it up over 100 years later. Philip Alexander Bruce, that monumental historian at the university who wrote his 5-volume history of Mr. Jefferson's University in 1920 to 22, he perpetuated that oversight. There's no mention at all that there might have been someone from UVA who served the Union cause. And so that takes us to, is there more to the story? Well, yes, there is. First of all, and what I won't really talk about today, there's the story of local African-American men who served in the Union Army and the United States colored troops, over 250 of those gentlemen. But what I'll talk about today is, more particular to UVA, is the UVA Unionists, which is an ongoing research project that we're doing right here at the Now Civil War Center, looking at all of those men who fought for the Union. It really, I'll give you an outline of where this talk is going and some of the key takeaways. For me, although they are numerically small, they remind us that to be a white Southerner in the antebellum South was not to automatically be a Confederate. Hundreds of thousands of white Southerners actually would side with the Union Army. These men were only a small subset of that much larger group. So the key takeaways for you is, and the outline for today is, most of these Unionists were officers, actually, and most of them were Southerners. They served in a variety of positions, so they're not all frontline troops. There's some non-combatants, some surgeons, some paymasters, etc., but there are many in active field commands. These are prominent men. These are men that you would think that the University of Virginia would want to celebrate and remember in its alumni publications, and with very few exceptions, it did not. These were men who attained great, not just deeds in the Civil War itself, but went on to successful careers as lawyers, doctors, politicians, civil servants, and career military, officers like Charles Irving Wilson, who I just mentioned. Many of these men, despite their prominence, ended up relying upon government pensions to sustain themselves and their families in their old lives. There is a certain stigma attached to that. Many of them didn't apply, but those who did apply definitely had war-related illnesses or disabilities that needed extra care. And so that is proven to be, interestingly enough, pension records, one of the best sources we have for information on our soldiers, for both projects, actually. And a number of these men would go on to promote the counterpart to the Lost Cause being the pro-Confederate version of the Civil War memory tradition of the Lost Cause, which Dr. Janey talked about. They promoted something called the Union Cause, sometimes called the One Cause, and that was a celebration of the moral superiority of the Union cause and the justness of the means that were used to win the war, including especially the emancipation of the slaves. So I think that my big so what is that in remembering this story, we enrich and diversify our understanding of what UVA's Civil War experience was about. And then we also remember a lot of men who were just really important in and of their own rights, even if they had never been in the Civil War. And it's important for UVA history to do so. So here are the facts and figures that you can take a photo of or whatever and take home with you. I just wanted to put them up here. I like to see things and hear them, helps me remember them. So 58 students or alumni served in the Union Army or Navy during the Civil War. A small number, but a significant number compared to the general, there was nobody explanation. There was only one professor who served in the Union forces, and that was Albert Henry Tuttle, who has a dorm named after him, right? He's the famous chair of the biology department, a very well-respected scholar in his own right. He served briefly in the Civil War in an Ohio infantry regiment. Now, as I said, most of these men are Southerners. You would think that, and sometimes people would say if they ever dared to suggest there might be somebody who didn't fight for the Confederacy from UVA, they might say, oh, these guys are from the North. But actually, 2/3 of these men are Southerners. At least a dozen of them are from Virginia as well. So these are men who, like George Thomas, the famous Union general, or Winfield Scott, who were both born in Virginia, who went with the nation over their section. Bill Freeling wrote a wonderful book called The South versus the South, if you want to have more of this interesting story about the divisions within the South that are sometimes glossed over. Now, where did they serve? The vast majority of these men, about 48 of them, served in the Army. There were 8 who served in the Navy. There was 1 who decided he wanted to do both and jumped between the services several times. I don't know what was going on there, but that's what he did. And there were a couple of men who served in the state militia as well, but in the Union state militia. Only about a half of these men would have been in what we would call today like frontline capacity. So a lot of these men are in supporting roles. A lot of these men, they went to UVA, right? A lot of them are coming here to pursue medicine, so they're going to be surgeons. They might be, in harm's way technically at the siege of Vicksburg, but they're not shouldering a musket. So that leads to the important point that none of these men died during the Civil War. There was some discussion about whether Union casualties needed to be added to that plaque on the rotunda. I can tell you, as far as we know, that is not the case. There are no men who died as a result of the Civil War. There are 2 men who died of age-related illnesses who were serving in the Navy, but you cannot relate them to the Civil War. They were well behind the lines serving in the Naval Observatory. 67% of these men were officers. I'm just going to hazard a guess, and all the old figures we have right now show that not anywhere close to 67% of the Confederates were officers. And certainly, it's notable that of these men, of about 60 men, 10% or 6 of them achieved the rank of brigadier general, which is much better than 26 out of 3,000, right? I can't do the math, that's why I'm in history, but I'm sure somebody else there has figured that out by now. So, that's staggering. These guys are elite. These guys are prominent guys. These guys are really good at what they do. Let me back up a little bit here to talk about the secession crisis at UVA. It was mentioned the flag raising that took place at UVA before before the state actually left the Union. This was a recreation of that flag raising that was done in 1961. No, I can't claim that that's a Civil War photo. That's 1961 from the, this actually made front page news in the Cavalier Daily, the Daily Progress, and then was reprinted in whatever the alumni publication of that time was, Alumni Magazine, something of that nature. So there are all these there were students who were writing to the newspapers, advocating secession before Virginia left because their elders were still trying to salvage the Union as best as they could until Fort Sumter. There were men who, as soon as Fort Sumter happened, it took a few days for Virginia to leave the Union, and in the meanwhile, these men left UVA and actually went and tried to capture the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. They did so with the blessing of the faculty, slightly controversial, and the chairman of the faculty, Socrates Maupin, thought better of it and recalled them very quickly. But I mean, this gives you a sense of how rapidly pro-secession and pro-Confederate UVA's student body was. And in fact, 515 of the 604 students at UVA at this time joined the Confederacy almost immediately. It's believed that some more of them joined as well. That all should not obscure the fact that there were 4 students who must have been scared out of their minds who ended up serving with the Union forces during the Civil War. And I'm just going to read the honor roll for you. Clinton Kleinbell, although he's an interesting case. Patrick Henry Darby, wonderful name. James W. Hancock, and George W. Woods, who I'll talk about a little bit more later. So let's give you some examples of who these guys were. Let's talk about some Southerners and some Northerners. Ray Wirt Davis, right here. So you can see he was fairly successful just from his photograph here. Was served in the Union Army. He was born in Richmond, Virginia, so he's a Virginian who sided with the Union. He actually attended UVA in the mid-1850s and joined the Army for his health. I'm not sure you would do that these days, but that was the reason he gave. And he was sent to Kansas, which I'm sure was better than Texas. We can say that for Kansas in the 1860s. His family was distantly related to Jefferson Davis, and a number of his more immediate family members served the Confederacy. He would stay loyal to the Union cause, serving as an officer in the 4th U.S. Cavalry, which was attached to the commands of Generals Don Carlos Buell and Major General William Stark Rosecrans during the Civil War. He was wounded at the Battle of Chickamauga. He was repeatedly promoted throughout the Civil War, absolutely successful man. He went on to become a successful fighter in the Army's wars of conquest and occupation against Native Americans after the Civil War, and he actually was also tapped to join Army detachments when the United States started to project its power abroad after the Spanish-American War. So he was stationed in Cuba and the Philippines, and even in China in the wake of the Boxer Rebellion in the early 20th century. He retired with the rank of Brigadier General and is buried in Arlington. Died in 1914. Now, the man to his with fewer medals is Henry Thomas Dixon. You can go to our website and read our latest blog post about Dixon. He's a fascinating character that I wish I could talk to you about all day long, but I think I'm already running a little bit long. He was born in Fauquier County in 1803 to a very wealthy colonial era family, the Turner family, major slaveholders. Not the guy you would think that would serve the Union Army. He was the quintessential Southern gentleman who, at the drop of a hat, would get into a fight or a duel to avenge his honor. That sort of stereotype of the dueling Southerner, the Preston Brooks kind of character. This guy was it in spades. He fought. He just loved a good brawl. When he attended UVA in its second session in what would have been the spring of 1826, he was suspended for fighting another student who actually tried to shoot him near the lawn. His gun misfired, so nobody was killed, but he was suspended. He was actually allowed to come back. He's not on any of the official records, but if you look at the faculty minutes, you find that he was allowed to come back, but he never showed up, or he absented himself without permission at some point because he was planning to fight a duel against another student who had insulted him, and he was expelled. He went back to Fauquier, became a very successful slaveholding plantation owner, and interestingly enough, he was the only man in his county to vote for Abraham Lincoln, according to one historian, with pistol in hand. You can imagine this was not a very popular thing to do to support the radical Republican who was going to take the slaves away from the South. Basically, Fauquier at that point became very inhospitable for Mr. Dixon, so he had to get out of Dodge, and he went up north to Washington, where he served as a paymaster during the war. He was actually killed in a gunfight on November 10th, 1865, by an old rival who he had shot on his property in 1857. I can't go into this story. Let's do it in the Q&A, okay? This guy was actually an ex-Confederate who had been a surgeon with Beauregard at Fort Sumter. So it's all very amazing, the connections. The interesting thing about this gentleman is that he was a symbolic of the Virginian who lost everything for his loyalty. So he alleged that his home was vandalized, his property was taken from him, he sought compensation. General Grant himself intervened to relocate his family out of Fauquier to Washington permanently and got his widow a job as a postmaster to try to support her and her 10 children who her hothead husband had orphaned the previous year. This letter is in the Grant papers. Bill Ferraro is here, former editor of the Grant papers, so you can see it for yourself there. Congress passed a special pension act to take care of his widow as well because of this, largely because of this dynamic. He was murdered by a rebel. Northerners also, obviously, a few Northerners went to UVA before the war, and they also excelled in their service as well. I'm going to talk about George Worth Woods, who's one of those gentlemen who was stuck here at UVA, wondering when his fellow students were going to turn on him, I guess. He left UVA, immediately joined the Navy, had been pursuing medical studies here at UVA, so he becomes a surgeon and serves in various blockading ships. Again, not really a great chance of seeing combat for him, but he was so highly thought of that he earned the Order of Merit at the end of the Civil War. He continued to act as a surgeon in the U.S. Navy for the rest of his life. He was one of the first responders, if you will, on the scene after the horrible explosion of the island of Krakatoa and the volcano. He was there on behalf of the U.S. Navy. In the 1880s, after a treaty opened up the kingdom of Korea to American business, he was one of the first people to write a travel journal, and it's an incredibly important documentation of that country at that time in English. He attended the last king of Hawaii on his deathbed and was given an award by the Kingdom of Hawaii for his service on behalf of that country, which was not a country much longer because we annexed it shortly thereafter. He retired with the rank of medical director, which is about as high as you can go, really, in the medical service in the Navy, and died in 1902. And then this man right here, who Bill will know as well, is Charles Ewing. Charles Ewing is sort of this. Sticks out like a sore thumb for two reasons. He's a Northerner and he's a Catholic in a heavily Southern Protestant university. He was born in Lancaster, Ohio in 1835 to a prominent Whig politician named Thomas Ewing, who had been a politician from the state, who had served in a couple of different Whig administrations before the Civil War. And he attended UVA with his good friend John A. Hunter from Lancaster as well. They both went on to serve in the Union forces during the Civil War. They attended for law school. And so, to make a long story short, he joined the 13th U.S. Infantry at the beginning of the war, but he was really disappointed because he was given he didn't see active service. So he got reassigned to his brother-in-law, William Tecumseh Sherman, who you may know, who had married his sister, Ellen, and he served throughout the siege of Vicksburg, starting from about December 1862 on through the successful conclusion of that campaign. Then he would serve as an officer and a staff member with Sherman through the rest of Sherman's career, basically, in the Union Army, so all the way up through the surrender of Johnston in North Carolina. He was the only one of our men who was actually achieved the rank of general before the end of the war, before, let's say Appomattox is the end of the war. He's the only one who did it. So he's a very prominent, well thought of gentleman. He becomes a lawyer in DC after the conflict, and he's probably the only UVA graduate at that time to be knighted by Pope Pius IX himself for his efforts on behalf of Catholic Native Americans and their religious rights. So I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here. You're getting into the post-war period, which is where we're going to turn to next, and say not only did these men achieve, were very prominent, many of them were very prominent during the war itself, but they achieved great things after the conflict as well. Historian James Martin has estimated that only 7% of all Union veterans were professionals, were in professional class. So, medicine, law, politicians, career military officers, that sort of thing. The rest of them are like unskilled or semi-skilled artisans or laborers. But our UVA guys, about 75% of them are in this professional class. So again, they are way above the norm they're way above the norm in terms of being officers during the war, and they're way above the norm in terms of being the elite of American society after the Civil War. They're lawyers, civil servants, doctors, even professors, which I guess is a professional occupation today still, maybe slightly of higher repute as well, we hope, right? So let's talk about some of these men. So James Broadhead is someone that Dr. Janey talked about, so I'll talk about him briefly. He was born right here in Charlottesville and attended UVA very briefly, and he would go on to read law. He was a lawyer. He'd read law with Edward Bates, who you may know became the Attorney General of the United States under President Abraham Lincoln. Edward Bates and Broadhead wrote back and forth a lot during the Civil War, very fascinating correspondence that you can get out at Missouri. He served as U.S. Attorney General, District Attorney General in Missouri, and Provost Marshal in Missouri during the war, and he was given the role of Colonel of Militia as well. He supported the Union because he thought that was the best way to preserve slavery. So not all these guys are 21st century progressive anti-slavery types. This guy thought that secession was going to kill slavery and that the only way to save it, he owned 2 slaves himself, was to stay in the Union. He continued to support the Union cause even after it became clear that slavery was on the outs. After the war, he would go on to co-found the American Bar Association, yes, that American Bar Association, and serve as its president, his first president, actually. Sometimes the UVA propaganda really is true that we are awesome and that we are everywhere. Really accomplished guy who would serve as a congressman as well, so you can see multiple careers here as well. And he would be a diplomat to France and Switzerland at the end of his life. He would end up as a professor, which at St. Louis, teaching law too. In medicine, there's almost too many people to point to, but I'll just talk about William S. Forbes, who was also a Virginian, who studied briefly at UVA before finishing his career up in Philadelphia. He was with Grant during the siege of Vicksburg. He was basically a contract surgeon, is the way that he phrased it, and he liked to tell this one colorful story that would probably be new to everybody here, that at one point during the war, he'd been out doing his rounds, and his clothes were so filthy that he had to change into something, but the only thing that was left was a lady's dressing gown. So he actually put this on and went to mess with Grant, and Grant walked into the room and allegedly said, "Well, I'll join you for dinner, but not in a gown." So that was his story. He's famous for writing and then passing in the Pennsylvania General Assembly the Pennsylvania Anatomical Act of 1867, which legalized human dissection in the state. So he was a very prominent fellow who went on to publish a number of important medical works. He taught as a medical professor at the Jefferson Medical College from 1886 until his death in 1905. I've already talked about a couple people who had political careers, or at least one person. Let's talk about perhaps one of the most famous, who was William Meade Fischbach, who should have been famous at UVA, but he wasn't. He became a state governor. He was born in Culpeper, again, another Virginian. I didn't plan it this way, it just happened. And he attended UVA from 1852 to 1855. He would read law with Abraham Lincoln in Springfield, Illinois. And Abraham Lincoln was so impressed with his work that he wanted to have him back. But for health reasons, he moved to Arkansas, which is the last which is, again, there's all kinds of interesting health reasons going on here. And he moved to Arkansas before the Civil War. His political career actually predates the Civil War. He was a staunch Unionist who tried to keep Arkansas in the Union. You may know that Arkansas was one of those border states that was waiting to see what would happen and finally went out after Fort Sumter. It didn't join the initial rush out of the Union. He was forced to support the ordinance of secession at the peril of his own life, he said. And he basically, the first thing he could do, he got the hell out of Dodge, pardon my language, and went up to Missouri. And he didn't come back until the Union occupation made Little Rock, Arkansas, a safe place to be again in the middle of the Civil War. He ran a Unionist newspaper supporting the Republican Party called the Unconditional Unionist. During the war, he was just begging to be killed by a guerrilla, I guess. He actually helped to raise the 4th Arkansas Cavalry. He never actually got to join it, and the reason was because under Abraham Lincoln's Reconstruction policy, he was elected one of the 2 initial senators from the reconstructed state of Arkansas. This is a really big deal. This really speaks to how prominent this guy is in Arkansas politics. Unfortunately for him, he had signed that secession ordinance, which gave the radicals in Congress the excuse they needed. They didn't like Lincoln's plan at all to reject him and to refuse to seat him as they did with other states who tried to bring reconstructed senators into Congress. He flipped. He abandoned the Republicans, became a Democrat, worked his whole life to repudiate all the debts that the Republicans had incurred in Arkansas to fund railroads and levees and other internal improvements. He was successful. He became governor on the basis of this in 1892, died in 1903, a guy that you can barely find mentioned anywhere at all in UVA history. And then the last person I'll talk about, because I'm just having so much fun here, and my introduction went a little bit long, was Charles A. Briggs. And if you don't know Charles A. Briggs, you really should. He was one of the most prominent theologians American theologians of the 19th century. He was born in New York City, so here's our representative northerner, to a prominent barrel maker or cooper. And while he was at UVA in the mid to late 1850s, he had this religious conversion experience and joined the Presbyterian faith and decided to devote himself to the ministry instead of his father's business. He would very briefly serve in the Union forces for 3 months at the very beginning of the war, and then spent the rest of the war at Union Theological Seminary pursuing his studies. He would also study abroad in Germany as well. Now, Briggs got himself in trouble with the Presbyterian Church because he was a liberal theologian, and he embraced the idea that sacred scripture is not infallible, that in fact some things that had been predicted in the Old Testament were not going to come true, and that was the position he took. He embraced this scholarship that said that the Bible should be criticized, and that was the way to truly understand the faith, was this historical method. This didn't sit well with the elders of the church, and he was excommunicated in a very public trial in 1893. So he actually maintained his teaching position at Union Theological Seminary despite all this, became an Episcopal minister, and would serve the rest of his life as a prominent theologian in Union Theological Seminary, dying in 1913. He's the one exception, I have to admit, to UVA graduates who served in the Union forces that the university actually cared about. I mean, he was a very big deal, and the university recognized that absolutely. But again, it's because of what he did after the war. It's in spite of the fact that he was a unionist. In fact, they thought he was a chaplain, which he wasn't. So they didn't even get that right. They didn't have the basic details of what he did correct. So with all these prominent men, you may wonder, well, what did they do what did maybe some of the ones who had diseases or disabilities, what did they do to sustain themselves after the Civil War was done? And what they did was they applied for military pensions, which was, ended up being a somewhat controversial idea. The pension law was passed first in 1861, and the laws became more and more liberal over time, so that initially you had to have a war-related disease or illness or disability or some wound to get a pension, but eventually it became if you had any kind of disability that prevented you from sustaining your livelihood, basically, you and then your dependents could get a pension after you died. A perfect example of this and is this gentleman right here. You can't read it very well, but his name is Marion Goss. He's very briefly, he's a very interesting fellow who attended UVA after the war, despite the fact that he would have been attending with a lot of his former enemies at that time. He pursued a medical degree at UVA, went back to Indiana, and was so debilitated by his military experience, he suffered from rheumatism, diarrhea, eye disease, etc., that he had to apply for a pension. And this gentleman right here is William Gillum, which means nothing to you, except the fact that William Gillum is also a Civil War veteran, but he was with Robert E. Lee and surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. William Gillum also attended UVA for medical school after the Civil War, and for no reason I can explain, decided to move to Indiana. They became best friends, and Gillum was essential in getting Goss his pension, which is kind of an interesting story. You talk about the animosities, but sometimes there's this reconciliation as well. Our men were not very good at getting pensions, though, which is really surprising to me. Only 77% of those who applied received a pension, whereas most men who applied, about 90% did. I can't explain this right now. I just note that, thanks to Lily's work, and move on for right now. 89% of the widows who applied, though, were successful, so they were much more, that's much more in line with what you would expect. The reason why I think that only 22 of them of these men applied is because there was this social stigma attached to being on the government dole. Even back then, even though they celebrated the Union cause, it was very controversial, all the money that was being spent on these pensions. It was a ridiculous amount of the federal budget after the Civil War that was going to these men and their families. And so men who were better off would just not, they didn't need to apply, so they wouldn't. They might have qualified, but they wouldn't. Here's what one of our men, Bernard Gaines-Farrar, told the New York Times. Quote, "I think our pension system is a fraud. I raised 3 regiments in whole or in part, and I am annoyed to death with able-bodied men who come to me asking for help to get them pensions. Unless the man is decrepit, I invariably refuse," which I think was rather cold-hearted of Mr. Farrar, considering that he was a pensioner himself. He had some significant issues as well. This is so if a man who's getting a pension has this opinion of most of the people trying to get pensions, and he's a veteran, I'm not saying everybody in the North thought this way, but enough people did that this was uncomfortable. A couple of our men were so bad off, so destitute, so disabled by the war, and their names were Robert Stark and Magnus Stribling, that they were institutionalized in what were called soldiers' homes that were created in the wake of the Civil War, and eventually there's a national network of these. That stigma of being that dependent upon having no family to take care of you, what did you do wrong? How immoral were you to suffer this fate? How pathetic were you? And this is the kind of thing that they faced. But that's not the only, so there's like that sort of, darker side or less pleasant side of the post-war experience as a veteran, right? But there's also this attempt by Union veterans, just as Confederate veterans filled the pages of the Alumni news and bulletins, et cetera, with heroic stories of what they did during the Confederate War for Independence during the Civil War, right? That avenue was not open to UVA Unionists, of course, but they partook in many opportunities to promote the fact that our cause was the right cause, the Union cause was the right cause, ending slavery was the right thing to do. We have made this a better nation. This was their version of the Civil War, and they were proud of it. And so how does that take shape? Well, it's just the same as in the South, right? You're using all the same methods. You're giving speeches, you're doing monument dedications to remember what happened, you're doing Memorial Day events where you're laying wreaths on the honored dead's grave sites, you're partaking in parades and veteran reunions, etc. And these are going to be held all across the country, north, south, and west, for these Union soldiers. The other thing you'll do is you'll join a veterans organization, right? And that's one prominent way of showing that you're part of that great war, of reminding people that you did something in that great struggle for the Union. And the most important veteran organization is this represented by this badge here. This badge represents the Grand Army of the Republic, or the GAR for short. It was founded shortly after the war and grew to a membership of over 400,000 men by 1890. Over 400,000 men of the 2.1 million, give or take, who served in the whole Union Army. That's a huge number of men in this organization. They fought for political ends in the terms of getting pensions for their members, but they also wanted to create a positive memory of what they did to get rid of that stigma, right? And to remind people that they had made these sacrifices. We've only found, surprisingly enough, I've only found so far 4 men in this organization. Farrar was one of them, Joseph Cabell Breckenridge was another, Jacob Mader and Marion Goss, who I already mentioned, were the other members as well. Where we've really found the high concentration of UVA Unionists in a veterans organization is in the elite version of the GAR, which was this right here. This is MOLLIS, or its full name is the Military Order of the Loyal Legion of the United States. Let's go with MOLLIS for short. It was founded in April 1865, even before the Grand Army, and it was open initially only to officers, so it's a very exclusive club, right? But remember, 2/3 of our guys are officers, so there's a pretty good chance you'll find them here. And in fact, there are 11 UVA Unionists who joined this organization that we know of. They were there to not so much for pensions, but to promote patriotism writ large, to promote the Union cause, to promote the positive memory of Abraham Lincoln specifically. And Bernard Gaines Farrar, who I mentioned previously, was the most prominent of our men in this organization. He would be the senior vice commander of the Missouri branch of MOLLIS, and then the next year, from 1910 to 1911, he would actually be the commander of the entire state. So Farrar is a very prominent guy in terms of all of these kinds of activities, pensions, the Civil War memory, etc. There's more on him on our website if you're interested in his story. Some of the other men, I'll just mention a few names, those that I've mentioned already, so you get a sense of who they were. Charles Irving Wilson, Ray Wirt Davis, William Smith Forbes, George Worth Woods, and James O. Broadhead, to name a few. All men I mentioned, they're all MOLLIS members. Again, this really emphasizes to me how elite these men were. And this brings us to our conclusion, in which I'd like to say that, yes, this is a numerically small group of men, but they're part of, symbolically, they're part of this larger story of men from the South who fought for the Union cause that are often forgot about today. They are also part of this richer story of UVA that has been neglected over time, that we've only started to address in full systematically in the last few years. Put aside the fact that they wore blue. These men are exceptional, absolutely exceptional men. So many of these men are absolutely exceptional. Ewing, Forbes, Davis, just Woods, really exceptional men that you would think that a university like Virginia would want to celebrate. So I would just like to end by saying that our project findings will go on, this is a prototype, if you will, a mock-up. Our project findings, which will include biographies of each of these men, detailed biographies of each of these men, essays on thematical subjects about a number of these men, transcriptions of primary sources, interactive maps, and a searchable database of these men will all be available online, knock on wood, this spring. Thank you very much for listening to me today.